Okay, I think we're good to start. Welcome everyone to our panel on affordable private school models. We're excited to have an all-star panel here. And we're going to talk a little bit about whether affordable private schools can be scalable models for change. And I think we want to focus on a couple of things in this panel. The first is it's been a tough couple of years for private schools, just like it's been a tough couple of years for schools around the world. In many places, as private schools closed down due to the pandemic, teachers weren't paid, students were lost, and many schools did close. However, some systems actually ended up not just surviving, but thriving, and we've got some of these on stage here. And today we want to talk a little bit about not just how affordable private schools can be scalable models, not just how they can be profitable scalable models, but how they can also be a force for equity and actually improve equity in low and middle income countries and not widen some of the existing divides. And so we're excited to have a great panel. I will introduce them and then I will let them introduce their organizations to you. I guess there's a little bit of noise from next door. Okay, sorry, I thought someone was speaking to me. All right, so maybe just to introduce as we kind of go around, Adrián Garza at the far end is the co-founder and chief growth officer of Mattilda, an edtech startup that provides financial services to private schools to help them scale. Lissy is the CEO and co-founder of Vinco, a startup that helps workers get their high school degree. Steve Cantrell is the senior advisor to NewGlobe Schools, a social enterprise educating over 2 million students, primarily in Africa. And Michael Horn is an author, most recent book, Reopen to Reinvent, and the co-founder of the Clayton Christensen Institute. And finally, Ujjwal here on my left is the president and CEO of Infinity Learn by Sri Chaitanya. And Sri Chaitanya is Asia's largest private school network with over 800 campuses now across the country. And so we have a variety of business models here and also a variety of models that serve both students directly, but also serve private schools in order to support them to scale. And so the first question I'd love to ask each of my panelists is to give them a chance to share with you their theory of change. So maybe starting with Adrián, tell me a little bit about the theory of change of your organization.
Sure. Thank you, Emma, and thank you all for being here. It's great to be here. I'll talk briefly about what we do at Mattilda. We're basically the financial hub for schools. So we try to leverage technology and financial products to empower schools to focus on what they do best, right? The academic side. And our theory of action, how we think about it, I think it's a very simple one, but a very, very powerful one. And how we think about it is school managers and school operators in Latin America, which is where we operate, spend most of their time on non-pedagogical, non-core activities to their operations, right? They spend a lot of time in collections, they spend a lot of time on invoicing and all sorts of activities that are not core to the actual mission that they started with. So what we try to do is we leverage our services to actually allow schools to focus on the education side of the business, and we take care of the rest, right? So we believe that taking that out of the equation of school operators will allow them to offer the best education possible to their students and actually increase access to affordable and more quality education.
So Lissy, why don't you tell us a little bit more about Vinco?
Yeah, what we do at Vinco is we make it easy for companies in Mexico and in Latin America to provide educational benefits to their employees. We work with companies like Walmart, 7-Eleven, Oxxo in Mexico, where we help the cashiers mostly get their high school degree or their college degree. A lot of times, in Mexico and in Latin America, 2/3 of the population of the workforce doesn't have a high school degree. And the main reason is, one, because of the economic concerns, but then two is having these flexible programs that it's difficult when you have 1, 2, or sometimes 3 jobs to be able to go to a physical school to get your high school degree, no? So one of our key components and theories for change is how can the company win by helping sponsor the high school degree, the college degree, and in turn the employee stays longer at the company, but then also through these flexible educational models that the cashier can take classes online at flexible hours, convenient to their learning styles.
Steve, tell us a little bit more about NewGlobe.
Yeah, so NewGlobe educates about 2 million kids, mostly sub-Saharan Africa and India. it's a whole school model. We are in partnership with governments. So there's two parts of it. On one side, we have low-cost private schools. On the other side, it's government partnerships. And in the government partnerships, it is all about the collaboration with the government. Our theory of action is consistency and alignment. And so we take over all the processes that need to be integrated and moving in the same direction. So whether that's the lesson design, whether that's the teacher support, whether it's principal training, it's the texts, it is the tests themselves, all of those things deeply, deeply aligned to produce better outcomes for kids.
Michael, tell us a little bit more about your work and private education.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I get to sit not as a model, but observing the space and advocating for the space. And from my perspective, I come to this work through the lens of disruptive innovation and Clayton Christensen's work. And there is both a lot of non-consumption in Africa, Bangladesh, India, a lot of these markets, right, where 250 million kids worldwide literally don't have access to school. Or if they do, in fact, the public school options, from a US audience, it might be surprising, but there's a pay component to it. Whether it's through the uniforms or the homework or whatever it might be, there's a lot of fees. And so essentially, from my perspective, low-cost private schools in particular can come in as these disruptive innovations to extend access, affordability to populations that otherwise wouldn't have access to these schooling options. They're often powered by technology. It makes them disruptive. You look at where you guys started as Bridge, right? With making that consistency and operational excellence across the schools, for example, to extend that access. And then I guess to answer the question, what I'm really excited about it is then it creates a dynamism in those markets where you can see replacement and further disruption to continually refresh the sector over time, to be more and more responsive or to be more and more student-centered over time. And I guess the last piece of that is that I serve on the board of Imagine Worldwide that is devoted to using technology to build fundamental literacy and numeracy in these communities in Africa through a tablet. And I'm really intrigued with, will there be new schooling models that start to wrap around this kernel of a solution to start to scale within different communities?
Thank you. And then Ujjwal, tell us a little bit about how that theory translates into practice across your 800 schools in India.
Thank you. So I represent Sri Chaitanya. It's one of the largest education chain. I don't know anybody bigger, maybe globally. We run 800 K-12 schools. And the number which we were just guessing now, every 2 to 3 weeks, we keep adding 3 to 5 schools. We're hosting 50,000 academic people in our schools. And this is all within India, across different parts of the country. For us, when we think about schooling system, we don't think about numeracy literacy to start with. We think about what is success for the learner. For us, success for him to get him to a better college. We largely serve low middle class and middle class. And in India, if you are going to a better college, chances you to get a job, and finally the family moving from lower middle class to middle class to higher middle class is a ticket to that. So when we think about the affordable schooling, out of this 800 schools, 300 schools we run under $300 a year. And to provide a same quality of education, ensuring that the teachers with the same level of intensity is a really big challenge in such a large distribution which we manage. So that's what we do day in and day out, and technology is a big, big help to manage that.
So I'd love to pull a thread from that, which is how do you get quality education at scale, at low cost? And would love to kind of hear from a couple of the models here how private schools in particular have a kind of edge on doing that. Feel free to jump in, anyone who wants to take that one.
When I joined NewGlobe, it was better known as Bridge International Academies. And we had about 100,000 kids in Kenya, a few in Uganda as well at that time. There were all kinds of pressures at that against scale at that time, because when you start to get attention, you start to threaten the status quo. And if we think that the struggles with some of the powers in the States are tough, they take off their gloves in sub-Saharan Africa. But our path to scale was primarily through working with the governments instead of being seen as competition. And what we did is we built enough scale to be credible. And then we went to different governments. First was Liberia, and said, hey, come see our schools. We're running a system. We think we can help transfer this technology around how to run these systems to you, build capacity within your ministry, serve your kids better. And that became our large pivot and our quickest path to scale, because now each contract is hundreds or thousands of schools. It's no longer, even at the 3 school a day, that was a lot of effort, because we were often building our own schools. So you could just imagine the complexity. Scale's much simpler at the government level than at the ground level.
For us, this is a 38-year-old organization. A couple, Dr. Rao and Dr. Jasi Rao, started in a small town in India because they wanted to provide better education to their own kids. And that's how they thought that why, and then slowly and gradually this story unfolded, and they said, if my kids want to get better education, why can't I provide to other students? And like that, this whole, and the next generation took over and taking it forward. But I think when it comes to a scale, at that large scale, when you have 50,000 teachers, almost 800,000 learners who are coming every day, maybe sometimes, our bus fleet is maybe larger than maybe state governments, bus fleets. Managing infrastructure, managing in-class transactions, and managing the safety of the student are 3 different ballgames. And I'm going to focus more on learning piece today. The learning scale, and we were talking today morning about this, that end of the day, if all teachers needs to teach a similar, I'm not saying same, but similar levels of intensity, and because we are saying we want to be a success-based organization so that the learner goes to a better college, we first said that technology has a big role to play. How much integration of technology we can do in every part. We looked at the overall pedagogy, we looked at each and every small component and said, each thing has to be digitized. Can the learning lesson plans has to be taken care of? Every weekend there's a test, and then the data-driven culture helped us to say that you can find improvement in every learner. And one of the really tough times were COVID, because that was the time when affordable schools were mostly hit. Because we were living around the data and we could help the learners when they were at home. We also went through a very tough time during that period, but I think the only thing which helped us continue is that let's not try to somehow negate the fact that learner needs input, and the improvement has to be on a daily and weekly level. And that we continued, even though sometimes there were situations where no classroom was there, internet was really tough for students, but we continued. Assessments was one of the things which was holding fort for us all this while.
It sounds a few threads I'm kind of hearing here. One is that some of the private schools have enabled systems for teachers to teach within, especially in an environment of potentially low capacity, not through any teacher's fault, but just having not had the opportunity to have the level of training maybe of US systems. And so technology then scaffolding some of the teachers. I'm curious also if there's kind of a consumer element. Are there elements, and Lissy, thinking a bit of yours, where you're meeting the needs of a very specific consumer or a specific segment of the market? Is there a place where private schooling can be better at meeting those specific and personalized needs?
Yeah, for us it's been interesting, and right now when Steve was mentioning the partnerships with the government, in Mexico what we saw is the government implemented this online program where you could get your high school degree, but results were so low that less than 10% would actually pass the final test and get the degree, that now some of the high school programs that we're working with have been hired by the government, because even if the government program was like $25 for the entire program, and these ones are $250 for your high school degree, the results are way better, as more than 80% of the students are currently passing and getting their degree. So the results are so much better that thinking as a company, when you're investing, particularly in the workforce, you want them to be successful in the end. So they prefer to pay for these programs that are not only available, affordable, flexible, but that will also provide the results. And it's going to be motivating for the employee that they're actually going to get good preparation to get the high school degree, which in Mexico is the GED equivalent of the US.
So again, maybe adding to the kind of innovation, systems for teachers, technology, that customer focus. I'm curious, as kind of going across, what are the biggest barriers that each of you have either experienced personally or have identified in the market to these scalable models? What's the barrier of getting bigger and continuing to provide quality at scale?
So something that we see a lot in Mexico and Latin America, and I think we can generalize in emerging markets, we see two clear barriers to actual scale. One of them is access to capital. So if you think about, at least, again, Mexico, Latin America, most large groups, large K-12 groups, are exclusively focused on the very, very top of the pyramid, specifically for K-12. And if you think about, there's few exceptions. There's Innova schools in Peru. There's groups like NewGlobe schools in Africa. But if you think about large, at-scale K-12 groups, they're almost exclusively focused at the very, very top of the pyramid. So, and when we think about this at Mattilda, is how do we actually give those schools, give affordable schools the levers to actually scale? And what we've seen is that there's no capital. There's no capital for these groups to actually scale and reach a broader base of the population. So that on one side, and on the other side, something else that we're seeing is that there's no access to more sophisticated management techniques, right? There's no tools, there's no software. Most of these schools operate very, very, very analogically. They operate very manually. And there's a lot of value to add there for schools in order to allow them to scale.
It's interesting. I was just going to jump off that from the opposite angle, though, because you cited access to capital, right? And number two, sort of the fact that you have to create all these processes or find it somehow. But I think to your question before, Emma, also, that's actually why the private school operators up here and that you all work with also have advantages in the market, right? Because you get to create de novo processes and resources, and you get to respond to market demand, whereas the government sector is often hamstrung in that because they're subject to regulations and legislation and unwritten rules and things like that calcify. I mean, frankly, older school networks also subject to these. But then secondly, they don't have access to the capital markets with a profit motive. And so it's funny, like the things that make it difficult, the definition of entrepreneurship, right? Starting something without resources under control is also the advantage, I think, on the flip side of responding to demand. And I just think it's important to clarify that and say that loudly, because it's very easy to say, well, either it's no different or there's bad incentives or whatever in private schools, and people sort of slip to that language, which I actually think is some of the biggest barriers which you all faced when the government started getting angry at taking students. And I think it's important to say, like, no, but these are the distinct advantages that private de novo models can bring to these markets.
And so obviously there is sometimes government kickback or concerns from segments of society, and I think one of the big concerns is equity. And are private schools just creaming off the top? Are they only serving the highest income students? And so I'm curious, do you have a sense of, in some of your models, how private schools can actually be a force for equity, for reducing some of the divides that we're seeing in our societies?
In our case, in Lagos, Nigeria, DFID, which is kind of USAID for Britain, sponsored a study of private schools, of public schools, and of the NewGlobe schools. It was under the Bridge brand at that time, and looked at this question of equity. And they had the benefit of having 3 different data points that we really lack in most of our studies. We had family income, we had family education, and then we had home language. And so these 3 sources of privilege. And we broke the kids into quintile groups, so 20% buckets, and looked at performance differences across these groups. And where we had the least privileged kids in both the private and the public sector, we saw a pretty steep line, performance gains at every increment, meaning there's great inequality in both these sectors. These were second graders in Lagos. At Bridge, it was really close to flat. And our kids from the least privileged households were performing as well as our kids from the most privileged households. And it led us to think, well, this wasn't a public versus private thing. It really had to do with the model. And it had me thinking about how privilege permeates the classroom and the classroom practices. And as I was asking, I dug into this with our academics team, why are we seeing this? What explains it? It's not public versus private. And it became a method issue. And some of these methods, like cold calling, were against common practices where the kid who raises their hand gets called on first. And you think about just the reinforcement difference, the celebration that happens as part of the method to encourage whether or not a student got a right answer, eliminating some of that fear of failure. And so you think about some of these things, the blocks that exist at the classroom level that reinforce privilege. If your model can start to attenuate those, then you have a shot at this. And God, it was so clear in the data. I literally kissed my monitor when I saw these charts the first time.
I'm curious, Ujjwal, you have schools that cater to very different levels of income. How do you think about this equity challenge in the context of your work?
So in my view, equity challenge is in a digital divide. So a set of learners who are better digital equipments, infrastructure, bandwidth, internet, and set of students who don't have. With this whole new change which is happening, the learning continues even after 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock when the learner goes back to home. And a set of learners who have better infrastructure, their learning continues better for a given period of time, and a set of learners who don't have better infrastructure. So our bigger problem of providing equitable education is not only with the teachers or what we are doing inside the classroom, but actually when they go back home, because the divide increases much more. And we continuously see that through scholarships, through whatever different ways, can we decrease the digital divide? Because once we decrease the digital divide, we can actually make the learning happen, make the end objective of education is serviced. So in my view, a lot of people are working really hard to see how classrooms can be changed. We are really working there, but what we are trying to say is that how beyond classrooms get changed. How do we provide, particularly in the affordable sector, the 300 schools which we run, how do we ensure that every learner have basic internet access, basic hardware at home, so that when they go back, the learning continues.
Yeah, and obviously technology, I think, a big piece of several of the different models here. I'm curious, as I hear about some of your models, they're catering to very different levels of students as well. And I'm curious if you think that the potential of private school is greatest, and I'll just take a couple of examples in maybe foundational literacy and numeracy, the Imagine Worldwide model, for example, which is really around getting kids literate at numerate in elementary, or if the potential is greatest at higher order skills, maybe exam preparation, which I think you're really well known for, or for kids who've dropped out later. Is there a place where there's a sweet spot for private school investments to really have the most impact on kids?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I'd be curious because you see this probably as you're providing capital to different providers, right? My instinct is that it's going to be context dependent on the market. And so where demand expresses itself most clearly, and there's a there's a vacuum of other providers into which a solution is needed. And so I don't think that's going to be dependent on, K-12 versus, high school and higher ed, frankly. Guild is sort of the analog, right, in the US. And it's doing a lot of college degrees and boot camp providers and things like that. And so my instinct is it's more where are the voids in the market and clear demand. And like the exams, obviously, in India are so important for the gateways that they, not in themselves, but for the gateways that they provide. And so you see clear expressed demand and need. And it's really analyzing the right levers. And I guess last thought on this, a lot of people in the US, this was like about a decade ago, got really upset when they would look at, India or Korea or China and see like the after-school tutoring market and be like, why can't we build something like that in the US? And you see tons of entrepreneurs and you realize that the market conditions just aren't the same. Like there's not the emphasis on the competent, proving mastery on the test and so forth that fuels that across the entire society in the same way. And so those conditions just lead to different opportunities for private actors, I think, to come in.
And in my view, this is very right, is that market conditions will actually guide that. And India is a 240 million in-school population. And only X number of colleges, only X number of opportunities. So competition to every seat is maybe 1:150 kind of a situation. But when you took up the digital education particularly, it really works very well in the test prep. So 9 to 12, the child is 12, 13 years old, he's able to deal with it. But when you come to, say, kindergarten, grade 1, 2, then physical education has much more impact. You need that camaraderie, so I think because we run K-12 schools, we also try to say that maybe early stage, let's not do too much of technology, let's just, do a lot more hand-holding through physical environment. But as the child grows, one of my belief, I've been very jealous with pharma industry. Reason being, they take a drop of blood and tell everything about our body. We take so many examinations, but we are still trying to say that how will the learner perform next time? How will he do next week? And they would have done it somewhere early 19th century. We are so many years behind. I hope one day in education you have one test which can tell, okay, this is the best thing for the child to do. But to do so, for a grade 6, grade 7 student, you start tracking his performance, his interest in math and science or other areas, and then you slowly and gradually shape up the career.
So talking of disruptive technology, and sorry, I feel like every panel has had to mention this, Gen AI, to what extent is that disrupting private school models? And is it disrupting private school models in a different way than it's disrupting the analogous public school models in those same countries?
It's really interesting just to jump in on that, like from the Imagine Worldwide perspective, and just to give you all a sense, right? Offline technology in places that don't have access to the internet, they get charged through battery stations that are powered by solar power, $5 per kid per year, okay? And so these models, because AI is starting to push computing power down to the device as opposed to be centralized in the cloud, our hypothesis is that you can actually start to do really interesting AI on these devices and then sync them up at the end of the day to figure out the playlist for the next day. And then you imagine creating, because I agree with you, particularly for younger kids, like there's going to need to be a physical component, interaction, and so forth. Like that's the schooling thing. So you imagine now a new set of providers like coming around and creating processes and community and so forth around that. Like I think that's a very interesting disruptive force that we could see come on in the private school market in the coming years, taking advantage of AI. That's at the low end. And then at the high end, I literally saw this in the last couple days. Scott Moore used to work for Extension Engine and University of Michigan before that. created an entire humanities curriculum, so an entire 4-year humanities curriculum in college, in dialogue with ChatGPT-4. And he wrote an open source book about how to get an entire education in Socratic method with it on that. Okay, so that's probably not a college by itself, but now you imagine what you can build around that. You can start to power some really low-cost, extremely personalized, demand-driven models that I think get really, really exciting and really interactive in ways that we haven't even imagined yet. That's my take.
Yeah, and well, jumping in a little bit on what Michael said, particularly in that building community, and for us, something that we've seen as of great value is this figure of a coach. A lot of times, when they're trying to get their high school degree, there's a lot of students that we see their progress throughout the different classes that they're taking. But then the day that they have to go and take the final exam to get their high school degree, like 3/4 of them usually don't show up. And it's because of that nervousness and that lack of confidence that's why we implemented this coaching infrastructure where they motivate them to go, and that if you fail, it's okay, you're gonna have another chance, but like go and take a shot, especially since a lot of them had like 100% grades almost throughout that, giving them that confidence and being able to grow even greater at scale is using AI to build that community and that support network, particularly for the students.
So I'm on the pro side of AI, and I think you'll see a huge change in next 3 to 5 years time frame. There's some text, audio and video, all will change. So one is teachers will get a lot of saving of time because of AI, because a lot of assessment can be automated. And we recently did a coding competition for a lot of our students, and I'm talking about GPT-3 was actually rating these codes in less than 5 seconds. So students were getting their feedback where the logic is breaking immediately. The other side, I think the huge change is going to happen from a K-12 perspective is the content development, because and we don't know how will that happen, is that who owns the IP, but a lot of text will get generated, who's owning the IP, a lot of images will get generated, who owns the IP, and a lot of videos will get generated in an automated format, and how will that impact overall that industry. But something for the good is going to happen. Assessment is definitely be one of the most beneficiaries of AI in our view.
Anything to add, Steve? Final word on Gen AI for NewGlobe, or?
No.
No.
We're a ways away from incorporating that.
I mean, I guess I'm curious to kind of put it back to the room. Curious as we're going to do shows of hands here because you guys have been sitting down for a little while. We need to kind of get you guys moving. Curious as you kind of think about the potential. There's been a lot of sessions here around Gen AI, around technology. Curious, maybe I'm going to ask you to put up your hand first if you think that there's more chance those are going to have impact in the public system or in the private system. So maybe put up your hands if you think they're going to have more adoption, more impact of Gen AI in public school systems, in private school systems.
Wow. Wow.
Okay, so private school systems.
That's a lot of faith.
So I guess the other then end of that question is do you think that, we've been trying to argue here a little bit that it's not just that private school systems can be innovative, which I guess you guys all agree, can they also be equitable? And so now as the show of hands is, do you think that, let's start with the private school, that move is going to help equity or harm equity? So maybe let's say, who thinks that's going to harm equity? And who thinks it's going to help equity? Now, we're about 50-50. OK, well, that makes me feel a little bit better. We've persuaded a few of you. So I guess maybe coming back to that as you kind of think about, and we've got about 6 minutes left, so I'm going to do a couple of quick rounds where you're not allowed to say more than like one sentence or a couple of words. As you reflect on that challenge that, yes, the private sector is likely going to be more innovative, but there's still kind of challenges on the equity side. Where are you going next? What are you most excited about? Like one sentence each. We can maybe start at the end and kind of go this way.
Yeah, I'm going to speak more generally, but what I'm most excited about and what we're starting to see, at least in emerging markets, again, having my experience in Latin America, is the rapid pace of innovation that we're starting to see, especially in a post-pandemic world. And I think schools were very, and sorry, I'm making this answer a bit more long-winded. Schools were very fast and they adapted very fast to adopting technologies in the learning side of the equation, but they lagged in the operation side of the equation. So I think I'm most excited about how these technologies, AI and other technologies, bring more efficiency to the system, and again, help pave the way to access to more affordable and equitable education.
Lissy?
I'll go next. We're still excited about this online education boom because it has really made a difference for working adults and being able to find the best programs for them that are flexible but also affordable, that the companies are willing to sponsor it.
So the great historian of education, David Tyack, wrote a book with Larry Cuban called Tinkering Toward Utopia. And the whole thesis was that most innovation within education happens around the edges, and it doesn't get to the core practices. And I think there's a great deal of truth to that. I think the innovation within NewGlobe is really, it's the lesson guides, which is a direct instruction model, but really and people think of that as deprofessionalizing. But I think if you step back and say, well, what are we really doing? We're preserving the professional judgment in the same way that, maybe a checklist would for pilots, so that they can do what's most necessary in the moment and not be thinking about the things that other people have already solved. So the problem that nobody solved is, what feedback do you need about your particular math misunderstanding? That's a problem nobody else has solved, and only the professional in the classroom can do that. But what example should I use as I'm teaching the quadratic equation? A lot of people have thought hard about that, and there's probably 10 of them, and we don't need to recreate it for every single teacher everywhere. And so the innovation, I think, is kind of maybe relaxing our definition of what it means to exercise professional judgment within the classroom.
Maybe we'll have our first disagreement here. So what I'm really excited about, frankly, is the next generation of bridges that are going to come along, but are going to do the same thing, but student-centered, so that it'll be individualized to what you need as an individual, not the whole class, and assuming you're all at the same level. And the teacher will exercise their professional judgment working one-on-one or in small groups with them, and that promise is, I think, finally going to be able to be delivered in these low-income, limited-income countries. And then, frankly, there exists a leapfrog opportunity to move past the Western education systems that were built for an earlier era where we thought standardization was the way you did everything.
In my view, in affordable schools, the students who we deal with, their desire to succeed is much, much higher than maybe a lot of affluent school students are. And that's the critical factor for us. If we take as learner and say, if his desire to exceed is higher, how do we help him? Where do we help him? What COVID has done overall is that it has made the whole education system very transparent. The teacher has entered the home, or home has come inside the classroom. With that, what we are largely accepting is that every learner slowly and gradually is getting a similar amount of inputs. Their discussions are far better, and somehow I think is that all of us own that teaching is not good enough till the time learning has happened. So we own that whether the learner has learnt or not, whether I taught the lesson hardly matters, quadratic angles or fractions. But if the learner has learnt that whatever I taught, I think that's the critical difference. And after COVID, I think a lot of school systems has been challenged, and they are adapting to that thought process that let's be learner-centric.
Well, thank you. We have a minute left, so I'm going to wrap. Thank you all for coming to this. I know that you're an audience of entrepreneurs. Hopefully some of you have been inspired to be entrepreneurial in this space. You're an audience of practitioners and policymakers. Hopefully some of you have been inspired to work with some of the private systems that are operating in your countries. And I know you're an audience as well of investors, and hopefully some of you are inspired to think about investing in some of these really exciting startups that are taking root all across the world. So I know I came in, to be honest, a little skeptical of private education because of the equity challenges that I think we all share. I'm hopeful with some of these models that we can not only roll out scalable quality, but also models that can actually help those students living in most poverty to really have opportunity. So thank you all. Hope you share my optimism and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.